listening to The Alex Jones Show.
There is a war on for your mind. Thank you so much for joining us. For the balance of this hour, award-winning historian researcher has a book out that's getting a lot of powerful reviews. The Chinese government helped compile a book a decade ago or so admitting that Mao killed 80-plus million. Our government says he killed 84 million. But we have one of the leading experts on Mao's mass murder joining us. Here's a Bloomberg headline: Starved by Mao, Cannibal China ate Earth, robbed graves. Continuing, Mao's Great Leap Forward killed 45 million in 4 years. London Independent. Here's another one, London Guardian. Mao's Great Famine by Frank-Dikotter. The horrors of China's Great Leap Forward are unveiled in this masterfully study of the hateful plan. Huge stew pots, cooking people. That's what the Chinese books I've read, translated into English, talk about. And this was praised by David-Rockefeller in 1976 in the New York Times. This is what big government does. And according to our government, any criticism of government is terrorism. So I guess this is the type of system we all need to live under, according to many people that worship big government and collectivism. But I really appreciate our guest joining us today. Frank-Dikotter is an author of Mao's Great Famine, the history of China's most devastating catastrophe, published by Bloomsbury and Walker Books. He's the chair, professor of humanities for the University of Hong Kong, and professor of the modern history of China, on leave from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Born in the Netherlands in '61, he's educated in Switzerland. It goes on and on. He's published 9 books that have changed the way historians view modern China, from the classics, The Discourse on Race in Modern China, The China Before Mao, The Age of Openness. Frank-Dikotter is married and lives in Hong Kong. He's in Rome right now. Sir, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you very much.
You've got the floor. Start at the beginning. Mao-Zedong, the greatest mass murderer in history. Now they have coffee shops and hotels and eateries named after him. Young people wear his shirt. I see it all over the streets. He's supposedly like Martin Luther King to many people. So I thought we'd have you on. Tell us about Mao-Zedong.
Well, he's a man who conquered China in 1949. And he's also a man who started the war in Korea against the Americans a few years later. And hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people lost their lives during those two particular events. But they do not compare to what happened from 1958 onwards, when Mao wanted to turn every man and every woman in that country into a soldier, into one giant army that he could use in the continuous revolution to somehow tackle both agriculture and industry at the same time. So what he did with the Great Leap Forward in 1958 is very much collectivize everything and herd people in the countryside into giant people's communes. People in the countryside had their homes collectivized, their land was taken away from them, their belongings were stripped away. They had nothing left except the choice to obey the party commands. And the party command was to work all day and all night so that the country could overtake England in 15 years. That was the slogan, to overtake England in 15 years. And before you know it, every incentive to work was stripped away, and people had no reason to work except the fear of pain and violence. So in the countryside, party officials and farmers became locked in a mounting spiral of violence, in which people were beaten, were covered in excrement, were sometimes buried alive for the slightest misdemeanor. Stealing a potato could warrant a death sentence.
Please continue, sir.
Okay, I'll continue. One of the big myths about the Great Leap Forward is that people simply died of hunger because there was no food available. But having looked at a whole series of party archives, you have to understand this is a one-party state that is very meticulous, like Nazi Germany, like the Soviet Union, very meticulous in compiling notes about everything it does. So these are massive archives, and they illustrate something that is very prevalent during that period, namely that food is used as a weapon. It is not simply that people starve to death. They are starved to death very deliberately. There's a deliberate selection of people who are banned from the canteen.
Professor, can I interject something here? Because I know you're very well read, one of the leading experts on the last 70 years in China. Have you noticed that they had a Beijing World Food Summit in the mid-1990s, and the UN said we will use food as a weapon? And in State Department Memorandum 200 by Henry Kissinger, he talked about using the Chinese model in the third world of using food as a weapon?
I don't know about it, but it doesn't sound very promising. That's all I can say.
Okay, well, let's continue then with the model of using food as a weapon, because I happen to have an article here, the Livable Communities Act, and the stated goal is to force people under Agenda 21 into sustainable cities and only basically allow big agribusiness to operate. But sorry, I was just drawing parallels to here. Go ahead, please.
Of course, there are parallels to be made, but at that particular point in time, the fact that a one-party state was in control of all the food meant that if you did not work, if you did not go to the fields and perform the work that you were asked to do, or if you were too weak or too vulnerable or too old or and sometimes too young to actually earn your keep, you were banned from the canteen. And entire groups of people were deliberately starved to death during that period from 1958 to 62.
Didn't Stalin do something similar in Ukraine?
Very much a similar thing. In other words, what Stalin did in the Ukraine and in other parts of the Soviet Union was collectivize the countryside and strip every incentive to work away from the farmers. In other words, people were locked in this cycle of violence with party officials who were there to take as much grain as they could and farmers who saw no reason to work except fear.
Now you talked about being buried alive for small things. How would they execute people? And I remember back in 98 or so, there were some big books that came out in China that the government, officially sanctioned, where they talked about 80 million dead, and they talked about large stew pots of human flesh. Is that true, or is that a distortion?
That may have happened in a few very isolated cases, but the most common instrument of punishment at that time was a stick. You just beat people to get them into the fields. When they're too famished to work, you beat them to get up, or you strip them in the middle of the winter so that they have to work just to stay warm. The case of people being buried alive is reported all over China, from the north all the way to the south near Canton. In one case, a man is forced to bury his own son alive because his son has stolen a handful of grain. Well, this man obviously is heartbroken. He dies of grief after 3 weeks. He can't continue. And there are countless cases of torture taking place for the slightest misdemeanor against some party command.
Well, now if you don't follow the smallest order, you get tasered. People die every day of heart attacks. But I guess that's America, so it's okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead, sir.
Well, I'd rather get tasered. I would rather get tasered than have one of my ears chopped off,
yes,
or my nose lopped off, or being buried alive, or being poured, being covered in excrement, or being tied up and thrown into a pond, or being branded with a sizzling tool like an animal.
Amazing. Please continue, Professor.
Very common ways of punishing people at the time.
Please continue, Professor.
So what I found, thanks very much to the party archives, which are only gradually opening up, so God knows what more is still hidden in the Central Party archives in Beijing. But on the basis of what is open now, it's unavoidable. The conclusion that 2 to 3 million people were actually killed is unavoidable as part of the 45 million people who died unnecessarily during those 4 years. An absolutely staggering number of people.
Professor, what's the grand total, though? Because I see numbers of 80 million, 60 million. I mean, what's the real number from your research? Overall during the Mao reign?
Well, the frightening thing is that so far, the only one period after 1949 that we've been able to study on the basis of the Communist Party archives is the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 62, when previous estimates range from 20 to 30 million. But on the basis of these unpublished documents, many compiled by the security police, by public security bureaus themselves, that has to go up to 45 million. Now, the question is, what happened during other periods? For instance, the Cultural Revolution, which started a few years later, or what happened immediately after 1949, after the conquest of power by the Communist Party with a reign of terror. So far, people have claimed that 2 to 3 million people were killed. It might be much more. We simply won't know till we can have access to the archives.
How does the U.S. government...
That has only happened for that very short period referred to as the Great Leap Forward. So it's anybody's guess.
All right, Professor, stay there. We're going to tell folks how to get your book on the other side. We're very honored that you're spending time with us. I want to just continue with whatever you think is most important because you're the real expert on this. But I want to ask you when we come back, how does the U.S. government come up with the 64 million number then? And from your dead reckoning, is that high? Is that low? We'll continue with that on the other side. We'll be right back. Infowars.com is the website.